So welcome back to video 3 and what I'm calling the nuanced differences. As I mentioned, there is a huge amount of commonality in the views of the interviewees, but also trying to see whether there were significant differences in the approaches dependent on their experiential context, in particular that of gender or sector. Interestingly, certainly from my analysis, there appears to be little difference when using gender as a filter. Both the female and male interviewees overlapped in most areas. There were some differences, however, in the sector, whether it's private or public. Notably, the emphasis on how leaders are intentionally developed differed between the public and private sectors. In the public, and particularly the military environment, there was a strong thread of continuous leadership training and experience. From the start of their career, they are immersed in leading at the practical level, making decisions and errors, whilst being provided a handrail of leadership theory and knowledge. It's an approach that's codified and is a constituent part of the talent management process. Military leaders in the talent management environment have to achieve certain experiences and have performed to a benchmark quality level in which leadership is a fundamental part in order to progress to the higher and more demanding levels of leadership. In short, they prove their leadership ability before moving on to the next appropriate level. In the private sector, what seems to occur is that leaders have tended to grown through a profile initially of performance or achievement against an output, where leadership may or may not have played a part in their achievement of that output. It's not formally assessed. This has subsequently led them into positions that have required management and leadership skills. Entrepreneurial leaders enjoy an altogether different pathway in which they've often dived into the deep end of organizational growth and have had to learn to lead on the go. The main focus being surviving and thriving of the organization, with leadership being seen as an enabler as and when experiences and reflection identifies it as so. In general, in the private sector, there is a much stronger value on the benefit of mentoring to assist in sharing and honing leadership experiences as opposed to the formal talent management practices seen in the public sector. Both have their flaws, both have their benefits. The key, of course, is to identify, is there a best approach in developing leaders? What our experiences from the leaders in the podcast are suggesting is that there is a hybrid somewhere, and that may be the optimum approach, but it is likely to come at a cost to compromise to some formally held or default principles. A development approach which can achieve fairness, a la the public sector, but also include and stretch the creative, innovative, motivated, and capable as soon as possible, seems to capture the characteristics of an optimum solution, and the latter tends to be seen in the private sector. Interestingly, many of the ex-military interviewees who now have foot in both camps express that value can be achieved from combining both approaches. So, having created the perfect leader and how to develop them, the real value in the series is to see where we can apply what we have learned from over 1,200 years of leadership experience today and in the future. But first, let's stick with the business of selection and progression. What the series tells us is that there are some enduring leadership traits that are agnostic of context and which all good leaders tend to display. These tend to be the personal attributes and approaches that ensure people will be motivated to do the task as best as possible, even when intuitively they do not wish to do it. Therefore, designing our selection and progression processes that reflect these attributes should enable us to shape systemic organizational behaviors. It should lead to a constant desire by managers to identify them in individuals, shape our development interventions to reflect them, and reward them when they are displayed. It's also apparent that the leaders learnt their profession over time and through experiences. This shouldn't be confused with older leaders know best, rather that good leaders experience meaningful leadership-related moments. Therefore, deepening the leadership experience over a shorter period through deep experiential moments, such as early leading a project, stepping up in role, offline scenarios, can all help in giving a greater chance of creating more capable leaders in greater quantities and importantly at an early stage in their career. I'm not advocating illness or bankruptcy as many of our interviewees experience, but how can we replicate scenarios where individuals take an unexpected hit so that they can show resilience to bounce back? To what extent are we prepared to take on the interviewee who talks of failing or fighting mental illness when we've already seen in our own series here that many of those experiences are hugely beneficial to generate resilience in individuals? Most of the interviewees indicated or explicitly talked of the continued existence of toxic leaders, and often in high and influential positions. The continued acceptance of toxic leaders is symptomatic of a short-term gain approach to strategy, but for enduring growth and progression, such an approach is unlikely to be sustainable, and that came across from most of the interviewees. Therefore, the trick appears to be to make toxic leadership socially and organizationally unacceptable, and this requires systemic understanding of the implications. If we continue to live with an ad hoc or informal leadership development model where time and experiences develop a leader, we will continue to underdevelop the capable and encourage the toxic. The consequence being we will continue to lose people, lose out on opportunity, lose profits, and fail to realize potential in those areas where there is less capable and enlightened leadership. Therefore, what this is saying is we need to create organizations where the personal and organizational moral compass is set to a default position that is common, ethical, and socially acceptable. I'm not suggesting the position is one which is common in its construct, but rather it sits within boundaries of acceptability, where something outside the parameters would automatically raise a social challenge, and the challenge would be both accepted and expected. As indicated by those in the series, the role of the leader is not to pat ourselves on the back for achieving, but to continue to be leaders and close the capability gap in the current model. So how do we do it? We appear to need to create a culture where leadership development is not an option, but a necessity, and one which is expected by those joining a business or an organization. We need to develop leaders much earlier and in a systemic manner. This could be formal and informal leading, the formal being some form of structured progression akin to a pathway as I mentioned previously, the informal being some sort of mentoring system. The counter-argument to developing leadership in an organization is to buy it in. It's definitely a model and one better than doing nothing. However, there is a danger of it creating ink spots of leadership without developing systemically across the organization. Another argument is the cost of leadership training. I'll simply respond by using two comments. The first was offered by Jim Richardson in the podcast. You think leadership training is costly? Just wait till you see the cost of not training. The second of that was to go back to Reid Hoffman, the leader of LinkedIn, who would seek to develop his people knowing they would leave at some stage. His point being that if they left with a view that the company was a good place where they were valued, they would go away, gain more experience, and there was a strong chance they would return in the future, and he would gain a more capable leader worker because of it. Another area which could be exploited more readily and is complementary to the learning environment I've just mentioned is data mentoring. It was strongly apparent in the interviews, but appears for most it came later in their career and or to close a gap in their personal ability or knowledge. Superb, and it's proved hugely valuable to them all. Therefore, we should spread the approach earlier in the business life of others. It would help close the gaps before they open and share experience instead of requiring junior leaders to wait for the experience to occur. If the benefit can be seen for our senior leaders, it would seem to make equal sense for those who may be our future leaders who are already shaping and influencing the innards of the organization. The second perspective I considered was that of what lessons could we take for the apparently unique environment we find ourselves living through today, that of social and economic impact of COVID-19. Firstly, I'd offer that viewing the situation as unique brings its own atmospherics, and generally a pervasive view is one of not knowing what to do. The reality, however, is the source of the issue may be unique, for the Western Hemisphere anyway. However, the effect of disruption has occurred many times in the past. War has always disrupted social and economic norms, while more latterly, many businesses and industries have already lived through technological disruption, with long-held business models being made redundant nearly overnight. As was the case with many before, the key is to be adaptive and innovative, and as was indicated by many of the speakers, empowerment and releasing control tends to lead to solutions that may never have been considered without opening the issue to all of the organisation. Therefore, as occurred with the survivors of technological disruption, and indeed the disruptors themselves, it requires leaders to adapt their organisation in a technical disruption context. They became flatter in their command and control structures, and their communications was more lateral and networked. Secondly, I'd offer that the leaders in the series offer a view that will continue to be valid as we move through the current context, and that is to see leadership in terms of having enduring attributes and attributes that change according to the context. In many respects, it's a bit like how we view conflict as having an enduring nature and character conflict, so too seems to be the case with leadership. Therefore, to take us through the current situation, we need leaders to continue to abide by the enduring tenets of leadership. Even more so, people need to trust those who have authority and power, and therefore, in terms of our previous categorizations of what leader is and what he or she does, remains vital. Authenticity, humility, ethical approaches, knowing our people, etc. So we need to keep going with these attributes. Not only is it important in continuing to value our people, importantly is it perceived to be the case by those we work with, and therefore they will stick around afterwards and businesses are going to need them. I'd argue the cost of not doing so will be felt beyond the immediate workforce. At a personal level, my family and I have created mental lists of organisations that have tried to get around the intent of the current measures in place. And these organisations will not receive our patronage in the future. They are neither ethical nor trusted, and we do not wish to be associated with them in the future. And I know many others who have expressed similar views. However, as indicated in our analysis, some leadership attributes do need to change when the context changes. We've already considered the need to perhaps be even more collegiate and open in our structures and processes. It would appear that the series offers 4 areas where we may need greater emphasis. 3 are existing leadership traits, and 1 is an emerging field of leadership. The first of the 3 is that of resilience. It goes back to the beginning of my analysis of the leaders in your series. They've all come from dark situations. They've all overcome dark situations. It's likely that we're all going to need a healthy dose of resilience, particularly that of mental resilience, to come through both the virus itself and the aftermath, which could include significant economic downturn. This is clearly easier said than done, and the extent of individual impact would be dependent on personal circumstances. The question is, how can leaders help? First, we need to recognise it as a factor in our businesses. Thankfully, many of the leaders indicated their awareness of the factor during their interviews in better times. Secondly, they offer another step to progress by highlighting the need for clarity. In this case, leaders need to be prepared to baseline their business areas in terms of the impact of COVID-19 and be clear as to the current situation. Then, as important, state a clear commitment and direction as to where the business is going to go. It provides hope and personal engagement. Show the humility expressed as a genuine attribute in the series by admitting we do not have all the ideas and answers, and it will be a team effort going forward, opening the channels for engagement as we do so. Finally, to use another of the key attributes in the series, use positivity. Explain what a leader always does in these circumstances, that of seek the opportunities that also come from the situation. The embracing of virtual technology to learn, more open communications, the bubble of freedom that will inevitably arise, the increased value of that which is truly important, not superficial, workforce, families, helpers, etc. Leaders and those who work in organisations are going to need resilience, and both can help achieve it by providing a picture for the future, one that can be better than the past. The second practical action is that of communication, and doing so with clarity. It was highlighted throughout the series. Furthermore, in the current environment where we are using virtual communication, often with multiple participants, delivered using poor connections, is particularly relevant. Not solely in order to get the message or directive across, but to show value, engagement, and continued interest in people as people. I was recently reminded of the importance of this by a work colleague. Like many organisations, we are turning our teaching into virtual lessons, and whilst this is a daunting challenge, the intent, approach to change, and the methods of delivery also need to be communicated virtually, making it a double whammy. The urge to control and not to empower is strong, but so too is the danger of assumption. What I mean here is assumption of knowledge, assumption of agreement, and assumption of commitment. Nevertheless, in my own circumstance, I grasped the nettle and decided to create a voice-over PowerPoint presentation that my team could listen to at leisure, understand intent, approach, and methods, and therefore get on with the momentum task. Needless to say, some received the presentation, some were self-isolating, some simply had not been able to connect to the system. Undaunted by the inconsistency of communication, some of it was unknown to me. On our first subsequent virtual conference, I set off to reiterate the message and set them on the way. Despite my obvious positivity and enthusiasm, I sensed the lack of reciprocation and engagement levels were not what I expected. However, I allowed my optimism to carry me through on the assumption that relatively downbeat response was a consequence of the prevailing situation and having to grasp with the vagaries of a virtual environment. We closed the conference, and 2 minutes later, I received an email from one of the team along the lines of, "Sir, remember we need to understand why we are changing, and you cannot assume we know what you know. We do not receive the same information." In short, my communication, whilst appearing clear to me, was confusing and chaotic to them, because in the turmoil of changing to a virtual environment, they'd been left out of routine communication and could not join the dots. I've subsequently changed to smaller group discussions and I'm about to adopt an approach championed by US General Sandy McChrystal during operations in Iraq. He held open discussions with thousands of attendees where he shared his understanding of the situation and importantly shared his emotions. My own experience not only reminded me of the need for clarity of communication, but also in the current environment, it needs even more cultivation to be effective, including choosing the most effective medium, not just the one that is available. Remember the series, leaders adapt their style of communication according to the context. The third area of emphasis, which again was articulated in the series, and that is purpose. And I think it's twofold. Purpose in terms of getting through the immediate situation, and purpose in terms of providing hope. Boris Johnson and his government, despite your political allegiance, set out clarity of purpose in the coronavirus circumstances. Stay home in order to protect the NHS and save lives. A clear purpose. We don't like staying at home, but the vast majority get it. Therefore, perhaps it's worth just checking whether as leaders we are providing clear purpose for the immediate period. I'm quite fortunate that I work for a leader who has provided exactly that. I currently work in a military education establishment, as you know, where we continue to provide education. Now it's through virtual techniques, but my boss is clear that as military people, our immediate priority is to do what the country needs us to do, and therefore this will override our noble purpose. It's clear, unambiguous, and allows us to make empowered decisions against clear priorities. In times of stress, people need to have clarity of direction. The second part of purpose is to look to the future and provide purpose beyond the immediate acute situation. Why? Partly to ensure a plan is in place to evolve out the current situation as opposed to go through a series of tactical wrenching experiences, often controlled by external factors, and secondly, because people need hope. As mentioned in the series, good leaders are able to look at the bigger picture, and it is going to be a key attribute that will provide the workforce, investors, and customers with a belief in an organization. My final lesson from the series and its applicability to the current environment is one that concerns an area of leadership that has been slowly gaining traction but may hopefully become mainstream, that of social leadership. I suspect we've all enjoyed and felt buoyed when standing on our front doorsteps or balconies and windows and applauded the NHS at 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening. It makes us feel good. We've also sadly been amazed and sometimes horrified of stories of people ignoring the restrictions, and it feels there is a collective disbelief and deep-seated unacceptance of this behaviour. This is not disbelief as an angry or bogner or frenzied, opinionated, shouting feeling, just one of that the behaviour is simply not socially acceptable. These are just two examples of what seems to be an increasingly self-adopted social self-leadership reference point, one in which society is saying, We should embrace self-sacrifice and commitment and have a responsibility for others. I hope it's not short-lived because we seem to have discovered a societal moral compass. My final point is more one of hope as opposed to a lesson learned. I hope that we in the West will adopt the social conscience of the less well-resourced parts of the world and invest in their development. For years, we have watched as viruses such as Ebola, malaria, SARS, and MERS have ripped through societies, and yet we continue to prosper. Now that we have experienced our own version of the devastating virus, hopefully we can now empathise. We'll not solely look to recover ourselves, but we also invest in the less well off. Not only is it the right thing to do, it may also assist in increasing world prosperity and reducing tension in the long run. It will not necessarily be a popular approach, particularly when domestic investment will be in demand. However, I started with Abraham Lincoln and I'm going to return to him. He made his speech of emancipation in the face of significant anti-emancipation feeling amongst his own followers. Why? Because it was the right thing to do for all of his people, not just a few. In his Emancipation Proclamation of January the 1st, 1863, as the nation approached its third year of bloody civil war, he said that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforth forward, shall be free. As I said, it wasn't universally supported amongst his own supporters, many of whom benefited from the previous economic and social system and wished it to remain. However, as mentioned by the leaders in the series, leaders have to make decisions and sometimes use their intuition. In hindsight, it would be unfathomable to consider his decision as anything but right, and we have seen many great people come from those he freed. Perhaps a more telling and immediate impact is seen in a letter from Hannah Johnson, mother of a northern black soldier, writing to President Lincoln about the Emancipation Proclamation on July the 31st, 1863. And she said, "When you are dead and in heaven, in 1,000 years, that action of yours will make the angels sing your praises." I suspect none of our leaders in the series will be expecting or even warrant such praise, but if we continue to show the leadership attributes articulated by them, perhaps the world and our people may mutter a gentle thanks. That's the end of the videos. That's 3 in a row. As I said before, hopefully it's given some analysis of a fantastic series, but I'd reiterate the point, people should watch all of them in order to get the richness from it. Thank you very much for listening, and sorry I was drinking coffee, but my voice was beginning to go.